What happens to friendships when we get old? The inevitable transformation of relationships. Have you ever wondered why the friendships you cherished in your youth seem to fade as you grow older? Why does the warmth of companionship gradually give way to long, silent evenings? Is it life's cruel joke? Or is there something deeper at play? Many people believe that solitude in old age is a tragedy. But what if I told you that it could be a gateway to the most profound joy you've ever known? Today, we will uncover the Buddhist and Zen wisdom behind solitude, relationships, and the art of finding fulfillment within ourselves. The friendship mirage. Why relationships change over time. When we are young, we think friendships will last forever. We imagine a life where the same faces will be beside us through joy and sorrow. But as years pass, reality unveils itself, people drift away, priorities shift, and even the closest bonds can dissolve. Why does this happen? Some say it is because people change, but in truth, it is because life itself is change. Friendships, like rivers, must flow. The attempt to hold on to something inherently transient only leads to suffering. Buddhism teaches us about impermanence, the idea that nothing remains static. Friendships are no exception. Expecting them to stay unchanged is like expecting the seasons to freeze in time. The moment we accept this truth, we free ourselves from unnecessary pain. However, understanding impermanence does not mean we should detach from relationships completely or avoid deep connections. True wisdom lies in cherishing friendships as they come and allowing them to transform without resistance. Friendships may evolve, fade, or take new forms, but they always leave imprints on our journey. Consider a tree standing tall in the forest. Over decades, leaves fall, branches grow, and the landscape around it shifts. The tree does not mourn the fallen leaves. Instead, it embraces the cycle, knowing that new leaves will sprout. Likewise, friendships enrich our lives in the moments they exist, and their passing is not a loss but a natural progression. Often, friendships change because our inner world expands. We develop new perspectives, experience personal growth, and move toward different goals. Sometimes, what once bound two people together no longer serves them. This is not a failure, it is life unfolding as it should. Yet, if friendships are temporary, does that mean they are meaningless? Not at all. Their impermanence is what makes them precious. Instead of mourning their loss, we should celebrate the moments they brought us joy. Every friendship, no matter how brief, serves a purpose, teaching us lessons, offering companionship, or simply making life a little brighter for a while. Clinging to past relationships only creates suffering. Instead, we can practice gratitude for what was, embrace what is, and welcome what will come. When we stop fearing the natural ebb and flow of human connections, we find peace. Friendship is not about permanence, it is about presence. Being fully present in every interaction, appreciating people while they are in our lives, and letting go when the time comes. This is the way of balance. A person who understands impermanence does not fear change. They welcome it, knowing that just as friendships fade, new ones will arise, each bringing its own unique gift. The key is to walk this path with an open heart, neither grasping nor resisting, but flowing with life's ever-changing tide. The story of John Walker, a man who lost everything to gain everything. John Walker had always been a social butterfly. In his youth, he was the life of every gathering, the friend everyone wanted by their side. He thrived in company, believing that the more people surrounded him, the richer his life would be. But as time passed, his reality shifted. His best friend moved across the country. His colleagues retired and relocated. His once busy phone turned silent. For the first time in his life, he felt utterly alone. The absence of familiar faces, the empty chair at his dinner table, and the silence that replaced laughter weighed heavily on him. Confused and heartbroken, he sought wisdom from an elderly Zen teacher who had lived in solitude for decades. "Why have I been abandoned?" John asked. "Did I not give enough? Was I not a good friend?" The master simply smiled and led him to a nearby lake. He pointed at a lotus flower floating on the water. "Does this flower seek out company?" the master asked. John shook his head. "Yet, it blooms in solitude, admired by all who pass by. It does not cling to the lake, yet the lake nourishes it. It is alone, yet never lonely." John's mind raced. Could it be that the fear of loneliness was merely an illusion? Had he mistaken solitude for emptiness, when in fact, it could be the gateway to something deeper? The master continued, "Loneliness is not the absence of others. It is the absence of connection with oneself. The lotus does not suffer when the wind changes direction or when the rain comes and goes. It simply exists, embracing each moment fully." John sat by the lake for hours, watching the gentle ripples move across the water. He realized that for years, he had defined his happiness by external validation, by the presence of others, by the laughter of friends, by the constant noise of social life. But true peace, he saw now, did not come from the outside world. It came from within. Over the following weeks, he began to embrace solitude rather than resist it. He learned to sit in silence without feeling empty. He took long walks, listening to the rustling leaves and the songs of birds. He picked up old hobbies, not for an audience, but for the sheer joy of them. Slowly, his heart grew lighter. He no longer feared quiet evenings. He no longer checked his phone in desperation for company. Instead, he found companionship in the present moment, in the simple act of being. One day, as he sat under a tree with a book in hand, a stranger passed by and smiled at him. For the first time in years, John did not feel a need to cling to that moment. He smiled back, appreciating the interaction, but not attaching himself to it. He had lost everything he once thought defined him: his social circles, his constant engagements, his busy schedule. But in losing all that, he gained something far more valuable: himself. He was no longer alone. He was simply with himself. And for the first time, that was enough. The fear of loneliness, a social conditioning. Society ingrains in us the belief that being alone is a failure. We see images of families celebrating together, friends laughing in cafes, and elderly couples holding hands. We internalize the idea that happiness is found in company. From childhood, we are conditioned to seek validation in relationships, to measure our worth by the presence of others. But if that were true, why do so many people feel lonely even in a crowded room? Why do some in long-term relationships feel more isolated than those who live alone? The answer lies in the nature of our connection, not with others, but with ourselves. Zen wisdom teaches that loneliness is not the absence of people. It is the absence of connection with oneself. If you are deeply in tune with your inner being, solitude becomes a source of peace rather than pain. The problem is not being alone. The problem is our resistance to it. The mind, conditioned by society, perceives solitude as emptiness. We fear the silence, believing it to be a void rather than an opportunity. In truth, solitude is not a curse, it is a mirror. It forces us to confront our thoughts, our insecurities, and our truest selves. This is why so many people escape into distractions, constant socializing, endless scrolling, meaningless conversations, anything to avoid sitting with their own minds. Yet, those who have embraced solitude speak of a different experience. They describe a deep sense of presence, a connection with the world that does not depend on external validation. They find joy in stillness, in nature, in simple acts of living. They are not lonely, because they have befriended themselves. Consider a mountain standing alone, untouched by human presence. It does not crave company, yet it is whole. It does not seek validation, yet it commands respect. The mountain is complete in its existence, just as we are complete in ours, if only we allow ourselves to see it. True connection is not found in the presence of others, but in the ability to be at peace within. When we no longer fear solitude, we realize that we were never truly alone. Mastering solitude, The art of inner fulfillment. The Zen master guided John to a wooden hut, surrounded by a serene garden. Each morning, he explained, "I wake before the sun, feel the cool air, and listen to the world awaken. In these moments, I am never alone, I am with the universe." John sat in silence. For the first time in his life, he observed without expectation the rustling of leaves, the distant chirping of birds, the stillness of dawn. All these details had always been there. Yet he had never truly noticed them. He realized that in his constant search for companionship, he had overlooked the companionship that had always surrounded him, the whisper of the wind, the dance of the trees, the gentle rhythm of life itself. The master continued, "Most people fear solitude because they have never learned to sit with themselves. They seek distractions, external noise, and the presence of others to fill the void they feel inside. But solitude is not emptiness, it is a space where we meet ourselves, where we truly come to know who we are." John's heart grew lighter. He had always believed that fulfillment came from relationships, from conversations, from being needed. Yet here, in the quiet presence of nature, he felt a connection unlike any he had ever known. "When you can sit alone and feel joy," the master said, "you have mastered life." John realized then that he had spent his entire life investing in others but had never invested in himself. The silence of his home was not the problem, it was his inability to find peace within it. He had feared solitude not because it was painful, but because he had never learned to embrace it. Over the next few days, he followed the master's way of living. He woke before dawn, listened to the world before it stirred, and allowed himself to simply be. He felt the earth beneath his feet, the warmth of the rising sun on his skin, and the deep stillness that lived within him. Slowly, he began to understand, true peace was not something to be found in another person, in a crowded room, or in endless conversation. It was something cultivated within, an unshakable presence, an inner stillness that no external force could disrupt. One evening, as John sat by a lantern's glow, he no longer felt the pang of loneliness. Instead, he felt complete, whole in a way he never had before. The world had not changed, nor had his circumstances, but he had changed. He had learned the art of inner fulfillment, the ability to find joy in solitude, to be his own greatest companion. And in that moment, he was free. The nature of friendship, a new perspective. John stayed with the master for several days, learning the art of presence, mindfulness, and appreciation of simplicity. He spent his mornings in quiet reflection, his afternoons tending to the garden, and his evenings listening to the wisdom of the master. The more he embraced stillness, the more he realized how much of his life had been spent grasping at friendships, at relationships, at moments he wished would never end. One morning, as he sat under a tree, he saw an old friend approaching. A familiar warmth spread through him. But this time, something was different. He felt no desperation, no clinging, no fear of loss. He simply enjoyed the company, relishing the moment instead of fearing its end. They spoke for hours, but John no longer sought validation in the conversation. He did not worry whether his friend would stay or leave, nor did he feel the need to prove his worth. He simply existed in the moment, allowing the friendship to flow naturally, like a river that does not attempt to hold onto the water but simply lets it pass through. For the first time, he understood, friendships are gifts, not possessions. They are meant to be experienced, not controlled. The pain of losing a friend had never come from the absence itself but from his own resistance to change. He had mistaken attachment for love, control for connection. As his friend prepared to leave, John felt only gratitude. He did not wish for more time, nor did he mourn the parting. Instead, he smiled, knowing that the beauty of a friendship is not measured by its duration but by the depth of presence shared within it. He watched as his friend disappeared down the path, feeling no emptiness, only fulfillment. He now understood that true connection comes not from possession but from the ability to let go. Friendship, like the wind, is felt but never held. It touches us, moves us, and then continues on its way, leaving us richer, lighter, and more at peace than before. It's the truth about finding happiness alone. Most people confuse being alone with being lonely. But if solitude were truly unbearable, monks and hermits would be the most miserable people in the world. Instead, they radiate profound joy. They do not suffer in silence, they thrive in it. Their peace does not come from external validation, but from within, a state of contentment unshaken by the presence or absence of others. Why? Because they have mastered the art of being with themselves. They do not see solitude as a void, but as a space filled with self-awareness, creativity, and peace. They have learned to embrace the present moment without constantly seeking stimulation. In the quiet of their own minds, they have found a depth that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. Ask yourself, can you sit in silence without reaching for a distraction? Can you enjoy your own presence without needing validation? Can you spend a day alone and still feel whole? If the answer is no, then the work is not in seeking companionship, but in strengthening your own inner world. Loneliness is not cured by others, it is healed by self-acceptance. When you can be alone and feel at peace, you will realize that happiness was never something to be found outside. It was always within you, waiting to be uncovered. Embracing impermanence, the final lesson. John Walker left the Zen master's hut with a transformed perspective. He no longer saw friendships as something to own but as moments to cherish. He had spent years holding on to relationships, fearing their loss, believing that their permanence defined their value. But now, he understood, nothing in life is meant to remain unchanged. He learned that relationships, like seasons, change. Some friends stay for a while, others leave sooner, but none are meant to remain fixed in time. Clinging to them only leads to suffering. Like trying to grasp water in one's hands, the more we resist change, the more pain we create for ourselves. Instead of fearing solitude, he embraced it. Instead of mourning lost friendships, he celebrated the joy they once brought him. He realized that the presence of a friend was a gift, not a guarantee, and when the time came for them to walk a different path, he let them go with gratitude, rather than grief. He began to see impermanence not as loss, but as life itself unfolding. The trees shed their leaves, yet new ones always return. The sun sets, yet it rises again. Everything moves in cycles, and so do human connections. With this newfound wisdom, John no longer sought security in people, but in his own ability to adapt and appreciate each moment as it came. He found peace in knowing that nothing needed to last forever to be meaningful. And in doing so, he discovered a life richer than he had ever imagined, one not built on possession, but on presence. Becoming the lotus. In the end, we are all like the lotus, floating freely, nourished by the world but unattached to it. The lotus does not resist the currents of the water, nor does it cling to the pond in which it blooms. It simply exists, in harmony with all that surrounds it, untouched by the shifting tides of impermanence. To live joyfully alone is not to reject the world, but to embrace it without attachment. It is to see that the sky, the wind, the trees, and our own presence are more than enough. It is to realize that happiness is not found in ownership, nor is peace found in control. True freedom arises when we cease grasping, when we let go of our need for things, people, and circumstances to be a certain way. Like the lotus, we can remain rooted in wisdom while allowing life to unfold as it will. We can love without possession, experience without expectation, and walk through life without fear of loss. We do not close our hearts to the world, but rather, we open them wider, understanding that nothing is ours to keep, and that this truth is what makes everything precious. And when we understand this, we will realize that whether alone or surrounded by many, our hearts will always be at peace, because true peace is not found in the external world, it is cultivated within.